Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 10. Ready for the Board Game. The leadership and management of football, one of the most diverse games on the planet, is still controlled fundamentally by white men. Dame Heather Rabbatts, November 2020. Companies that are led by diverse teams are more successful, and organisations with diverse boards have better governance and make better decisions. Diversity in an organisation also increases the talent pool, enhances productivity and innovation, and improves employee retention. These are widely accepted facts in the corporate world, yet for some sports bodies, leagues and clubs, things have not really changed from the 1800s, when organised sport first developed, organised for men, by men. The world of sport has evolved, becoming more global, inclusive and commercial, yet the sports bodies themselves have been slow to modernise, perhaps unwilling to give up the power enjoyed by the few that control them. Many original leaders in the sports industry were former male athletes, when women weren't even taking part. And over time, they have continued to appoint more people like them. And what we now consider to be an old boys network has evolved across sports leadership. In the 2015 Netflix film Death of a Gentleman, which depicts the corruption in world cricket, Giles Clarke, then president of the ECB, says, "We've been involved in playing cricket and administering cricket forever." An innocent comment, perhaps, as his family have a long history of running cricket. But in reality, it highlights a huge issue in sports governance that's finally being questioned. With many sports boards and organisations run on a voluntary basis, much of the sector has been administered by a small group who can afford to do it for free. The "we" that Giles Clarke refers to are the white, well-off, middle-aged men. The world is changing, though, driven in part by some shocking high-profile governance scandals at major sports organisations in the past decade, including FIFA, the FA, the IAAF, the ICC, British Cycling, USA and British Gymnastics, and the IOC. I asked Jo Bostock, co-founder of the Women's Sport Trust, who also runs a leadership development business, why it's good for organisations to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. If you want to be effective at what you do in any kind of business, you need to have the best people giving of their best. And if you split that equation in half, you need to have a great mix of people. I think talent is evenly distributed. It doesn't sit with one gender or one background. So how do you get a great bunch of people around the table? That's your first start. But if you've got them there, and then you're not giving them a chance to flourish and contribute and add value and disagree with you and bring their ideas, then you're not going to get absolutely the best performance. So get a great mix in the room, because then you have a chance of getting the right people to perform, and then create the conditions for them to give of their best, and you'll absolutely fly. In 2016, Women in Sport published a report entitled Trophy Women, No More Board Games, to review the current state of equality in sports management in the UK. The then CEO, Ruth Holdaway, pointed out in the introduction, taken at face value, the findings of this report should be a cause for celebration. Following 6 years of research by Women in Sport into the gender diversity of sports boards, female representation on the boards of national governing bodies and other sports organisations funded and supported by Sport England and UK Sport is finally averaging 30%. If you compare this to our first set of data in 2009, when survey findings put the proportion of women on boards at only 21%, progress has been marked. Ruth went on to highlight that, despite this looking positive, further research with women and men at the top of sports organisations showed that the same barriers persisted in preventing many women from taking on leadership roles and contribute to a continued gender imbalance on boards. The result was a lack of a sustainable pipeline of female leaders rising to the top. On the ground, not much had changed, and for some sports, nothing had changed. The next stage on the journey to equality is to mainstream and normalise senior-level female representation in sport and establish a system for recruitment and promotion based on skill, competency and meritocracy to give a fair chance to any deserving candidate, Ruth concluded. In 2016, there was quite a shake-up in British sport when a new code for sports governance was launched, setting out the levels of transparency, accountability and financial integrity required from anyone receiving government or national lottery funding. The makeup of boards was a key element of this new code, with a target for all sports bodies to adopt a target of and take all appropriate actions to encourage a minimum of 30% of each gender on its board. For the sports bodies and organisations receiving substantial funds from Sport England who didn't have a single woman on their boards at the time, this was quite a wake-up call. In 2019, leading sports law firm Farrer & Co. gathered data about board composition from 131 sports organisations, including national governing bodies and commercial clubs. The findings were fascinating. First, the good news. Across the 57 national governing bodies, they found an average of 35% of the board members were female, and that 72% of the sports bodies had met the 30% target. In addition, 37% had a woman in a leadership position on the board. Evidently, the Code for Sports Governance was having the desired impact. The three largest participation sports, football, cricket and rugby, which had all seen considerable growth and success in their women's games in recent years, were all hitting around the 30% mark. The FA led the way with 4 female members on a board of 10, the ECB had 4 out of 12, and the RFU had 4 out of 14. This is especially good when compared to what is happening at the same time in Northern Ireland. In the summer of 2020, it was revealed that Northern Ireland's 3 main sporting bodies, the Irish FA, Ulster GAA and Ulster Rugby, have only 1 female each on their highest decision-making committees. Just 3 out of 36 positions were held by women. Stating the blindingly obvious, Carol Nickellen, the Department for Communities Minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly, said, "It is clear there is more work to be done with governing bodies to provide opportunities for females to be appointed to the boards of the major sporting organisations." Reacting to the figures, Sport Northern Ireland, responsible for the development of sport in the region, said it encourages the appointment of more independent external members, but it's clear that verbal encouragement will never be enough to drive structural change. It took the potential loss of funding from Sport England to drive many of the governance changes from the FA, RFU and ECB. Once again, money talks. The results from the commercial clubs in the UK, over which Sport England had no financial influence, showed a very different and disappointing picture. In a sample that included clubs from the Football Premier and Championship Leagues, the Rugby Premiership, and the county cricket clubs, the average for board positions held by women was just 8%. In fact, only 3% of commercial clubs met the 30% target. In the Premier League in 2019, only one of its 20 clubs met the 30% threshold, and 11 clubs had no women on their boards. Not one. No women were on the boards of Arsenal, Manchester City or Liverpool. Yet ironically, the first two clubs mentioned are at the forefront of driving the women's professional game. How can a football club like Manchester City be taken seriously in its huge campaign to promote gender equality, same city, same passion, when it doesn't have a single woman on its board? The picture in the Championship is even worse, where no club met the 30% threshold and 18 of the 24 clubs had no women on their boards. In rugby union, it was a similar picture, with only one Premiership club meeting the 30% threshold. Kudos to Exeter Chiefs, who hit 50% with 4 female board members on a board of 8. Harlequins were close, with 25% female representation, but despite these two positives, across the 12 clubs, the average representation of women on boards was 10%. It is especially disappointing to see a club like Saracens, who were pioneers for the women's game when they established a women's team back in 1989, without a single woman on its board. Perhaps some more diverse thinking could have helped them through the decision-making around spending caps in recent years. As you may imagine, the picture in county cricket clubs, considered by many to be the preserve of male dominance, is the worst of all. Across all the 193 board or committee positions, women make up less than 10%. In fact, representation of women on boards is below 20% at every club. Male decision-makers in cricket clearly feel women in the sport are better suited to making teas in the pavilion. In total, 53% of professional clubs in football, cricket and rugby have no women on boards, and just 3% meet the 30% target. It's the same with many global sports bodies. In 2000, the International Olympic Committee set targets of 20% for women in sports leadership. Yet by 2016, the average across all Olympic committees was still only 9%. Worse still, women represented only 5.7% of international federation presidents, 12.2% of vice presidents, and just 13.1% of committee members. Aside from the issues of equality of opportunity and respect for women, you would think that the commercial benefits of a diverse board might appeal to those heading these sports. Studies from respected organisations such as McKinsey and Harvard Business School show that diverse boards make better decisions and are generally 10 to 15% more profitable. Who would not want to be at least 10% more profitable? If the national governing bodies of sports like football, rugby and cricket see women as integral to the ongoing growth of their sports, then surely they recognise that it makes good sense to have more women at the top table. Similarly, if the clubs are hoping to develop strong, successful women's sides, the female representation on their boards is more than a statement of intent. It will help them achieve these goals, with the viewpoint of women included in the biggest decisions for clubs. Having a diverse board also improves the management of risk. You don't have people with the same backgrounds and opinions reinforcing decisions. There is much risk for commercial sports organisations right now. Do they really believe that only men have the answers? As Tom Bruce from Farrer & Co points out, gender diversity and good governance go hand in hand. Increasing the number of women on boards is by no means a guarantee of a well-governed organisation, but it is one of the fundamental building blocks. Along with better governance, identifying risks, and capitalising on opportunities, a gender-balanced board at the top of an organisation has also been shown to have a significant impact on the entire organisation in terms of staff recruitment, grassroots activity, marketing, advertising, and the structure of competitions. These patterns are very similar across the world. A 2016 global study on sports governance included an audit of gender ratio on the boards of national sports organisations in 45 countries. The findings show that women remain underrepresented in 3 key areas: as board directors, 19.7%, board chairs, 10.8%, and chief executives, 16.3%. Few countries have achieved the critical mass of 30% representation, and no continent has achieved the critical mass on any of the 3 indicators. In Australia, the approach to encourage gender diversity on boards is 40-40-20. Boards need to have 40% male, 40% female, and then 20% of any gender. As a result of this and the adoption of FIFA's 2016 gender reforms, in 2020 it was announced that Football Federation Australia had become one of very few international federations to have a 50-50 gender-balanced board. Certainly something to celebrate. One Australian who knows all about the impact of gender reform on sports is Moya Dodd, one of the most respected women in global sports governance. I asked Moya how it felt to be one of the first women on the FIFA Council in 2013. It was fascinating. We were the first 3 women on that board in 108 years of FIFA. We got to go inside and see what it had become in those 108 years. One of the first bits of advice Moya was given by one of the members was to say nothing in board meetings, although she imagines men who joined had been given the same advice to ensure political survival. Her interpretation was, make yourself a small target and say nothing. Just be polite, small, open doors for people, come, go, don't be a spectacle. Moya decided that she hadn't come to be one of the first 3 women in 108 years to not say anything. I felt it was important that they got used to hearing women's voices in the room, to hear a woman speak. So I decided at that point that I would speak at every meeting, and I would pick my topic carefully. You can't speak too often or for too long because people will find that annoying and will turn off. It really was an environment that was quite unused to having too much diversity of thought. Diversity is important to decision-making because diverse groups just make better decisions. It is not just gender diversity that is important, it is diversity of many dimensions. But in an organisation that had actively excluded women for so long, I felt gender diversity was really important, and I hadn't come to sit and be silent. Another impressive woman making waves in a very male-dominated sport is Claire Connor, former international cricketer and now Managing Director of Women's Cricket at the ECB. As I mentioned in my 12 game-changing moments, in October 2021, Claire will become the first female president of Marylebone Cricket Club. I was interested to know how she has learned to operate as a woman in such a predominantly male environment after 13 years at the governing body. It's not easy. I think you learn a lot about yourself that leads to analysis about your character, how you are going to approach things. I might feel so angry or so emotional about something, and I'm not going to say that can't happen in other environments, regardless of gender. But it's been fascinating to reflect on how you do handle each situation. One thing is certainly presenting to the board, when the board used to be virtually all male and sort of presiding over a very male sport. It's about recognising that you've got to be really well prepared. This is something I often hear from senior women in sport. To be considered on a level with your male colleagues, you must know even more than they do and be better briefed and prepared for meetings. You find a way to manage, and sometimes showing emotion is good, and sometimes it isn't. You learn how to let that manifest and when to try and suppress it. You learn when you need to be patient and when something just isn't acceptable. So there are times when patience and the long game is what you're playing, and there are times when, no, this isn't okay, and you can't let something go. For some sports, it appears to be one step forward and one back as they make strides for better female equality only to lapse into more traditional approaches. A case in point is World Rugby, who appear to have been at the forefront of driving more inclusivity across the organisation. Katie Sadlier, General Manager of Women's Rugby at World Rugby, laughed when I asked her about how, when she joined, she'd been told there was no way World Rugby would ever allow women on its council. She arrived at an organisation where 27% of the players globally were women, and yet they were governed by a board of 30 men. She thought at the time, okay, so there are some big changes about to happen around here. Katie gives full credit to the men involved in World Rugby who realised you can't say that you want to be world leading in sport and then not be committed to international best practice. We needed to do something significant and impactful early on if we were going to drive the transformation that needed to happen around the globe. On the day they signed off on the 8-year strategy, we changed the governance structure of World Rugby and brought on 17 new women directors. So, from 0 to 36%, just like that. So when people say things like that can't happen, they certainly can happen. And yet, just a few months later, in May 2020, World Rugby announced its new executive committee, and for the second successive term, Angela Ruggiero was the only woman on a 12-strong board. This lack of diversity was beautifully highlighted on social media with a tweet from Alison Donnelly, the founder of Scrum Queens, who pointed out that there were more Bretts than women on the committee. Fiona Hathorn, the CEO of Women on Boards, reflected, if World Rugby understood the benefits of diversity, they would have at least 30% of their board seats taken by women. By announcing only one woman on its board, World Rugby are sending a clear message to rugby boards across the world that women don't matter as regards governance and strategic decision-making. I'm told to expect some significant positive changes soon when Hugh Robertson's independent governance review is published. First on the list of issues to be considered is gender balance and diversity on World Rugby boards and committees. FIFA, too, despite some changes to improve the gender balance on its council, still has a long way to go before the voices of women in the game are truly represented at the very top of the sport. As Moya Dodd points out, the electoral system at the moment is not optimal. I think that as a quota in these roles, it's your job to represent the people who are not otherwise represented. The current electoral system doesn't really enable that to happen, because the same people who vote for all the men are the ones who are selecting the woman who will go to FIFA from that confederation. If you ask the women in football, the ones who are supposed to be being represented, who they would like, you might get a different answer. But they're not asked. Despite these issues, it does feel like the gender balance on major sports boards is in a much better position than it was even a decade ago. For instance, the number of women sitting on UEFA boards has increased by 50% since 2019. You're also less likely to have a chair or CEO appoint a new board member on the basis of him being someone I know personally who can do that job, and more likely to see sports undertaking a rigorous, transparent, open, public recruitment process, as it should be. The running of sports is becoming ever more commercial, so the competition to find the very best people increases. Doubling the pool to recruit from must surely be an advantage. In the summer of 2020, UK Sport and Sport England announced the first joint review of the Code for Sports Governance, identifying areas where the code would benefit from further development. Responding to a heightened debate around racial equality in 2020, a significant focus will be the elements of the code that support equality, diversity and inclusion, aimed at ensuring greater representation of those from ethnically diverse backgrounds, those with a disability or long-term health condition, and female representation on sporting boards. As Tim Hollingsworth, Chief Executive of Sport England, pointed out, the Code for Sports Governance has undoubtedly pushed the standard of sports governance to a new level and has been an amazing tool for reform, particularly where bringing about greater gender parity is concerned. However, we are more aware than ever of the work that remains to be done, particularly where equality and diversity at board and leadership level is concerned. With Black, Asian and minority ethnic numbers at board and leadership levels quite rightly in the spotlight at the moment, this must not be another false dawn for addressing the racial inequalities that exist within sport, and the review of the Code for Sports Governance will serve as one of the key pieces of work on this front. Research by UK Sport and Sport England in 2019 had found that ethnically diverse people accounted for just 5.2% of board members across their 130 funded organisations. More concerning was that across the major sports, there was just one female black board member, Anne Wafula-Strike from UK Athletics. I asked Jane Purden, a co-author of the original code at UK Sport and now CEO at Women in Football, if she felt the 40-40-20 governance goal for boards in Australia would have been a better target for UK Sport and Sport England back in 2016. I think there's a couple of things about targets looking back. I think 30% was right for the time, but I prefer 40-40-20 now. The bit that the code didn't get right was on ethnic diversity. I think we've got to be honest. It didn't work to shift the dial enough on getting more Black and Asian people onto the boards of British sports. So I'm very pleased it's being reviewed. Tanni Grey-Thompson, who won 11 Paralympic gold medals for Great Britain and now sits as an independent peer in the House of Lords, is, as always, forthright in her opinions. We have a lack of female coaches, lack of women in leadership roles in sport, lack of female agents, and the cycle perpetuates. I asked Tanni if she feels things are beginning to look more positive. I do speak to more women who want to come into sport, into the admin side. I think sometimes it's hard to get your foot in the door and it's hard to challenge some of the stereotypes that exist. But this is where I think sport shouldn't think of itself as different. If businesses must have 50-50 representation on the board, sport should be the same. And I take quite a harsh view. You know, governing bodies have had a long time to do that. Lots of public money. Just do it. We need to do more to have more women in leadership. I think for a lot of female athletes, it's hard to know what to do as they transition. There's more we can do around helping them to get some more of these skills. So when they transition out of elite sport, they do have options. Because I don't want to be looking around boardrooms and be the only disabled person in the room, or the only disabled woman, or the only woman. And that is changing. But I'd just like it to be a bit quicker. For all the positive changes we're seeing in the governance of sport in Britain, on November 10, 2020, there was a collective sigh of frustration and disappointment when Greg Clark, chair of the FA, appeared before the DCMS Select Committee to talk about the state of football. His racially offensive, sexist, and homophobic remarks were especially embarrassing for the FA as they'd launched their Football Diversity Leadership Code just 2 weeks earlier. The powerful video that accompanied the launch included soundbites that seemed hollow following the comments of the FA chair. Football has been great at campaigning for change, but now we need to drive that change from within. We have to fight discrimination on and off the pitch. We know we have diversity on the pitch, but we need to do more off it. Greg Clark's subsequent resignation means that one of the highest profile and most influential roles in British sport is now vacant. It will be fascinating to see who is appointed and the message this sends to other sports bodies. One positive to take from the Greg Clark incident was the huge instant reaction from the sports sector and general public, united in collectively recognising that comments like this are completely unacceptable. Similar public outrage followed the sexist remarks of 83-year-old Yoshiro Mori, then head of the Tokyo Olympics Organising Committee, who, in early 2021, reportedly commented, "If we increase the number of female board members, we have to make sure their speaking time is restricted somewhat, as they have difficulty finishing, which is annoying. We have about 7 women at the organising committee, but everyone understands their place." Japan's Olympic minister, Seiko Hashimoto, said she wanted to hold thorough discussions with Mr. Mori, who was formerly Japanese Prime Minister, reflecting, "The Olympics' fundamental principle is to promote women's advancement in sport at all levels and organisations in order to realise gender equality." In a drive to ensure better gender balance on sports boards, I personally always make an effort to encourage more women to step forward and apply to be trustees or non-executive directors. The more women we see in senior roles, the more it will encourage others to follow. I have loved being a non-executive director on a number of boards, but, like many women, had imposter syndrome when I was invited to apply to be chair of Get Berkshire Active, an active partnership. We hear so much about imposter syndrome, the belief that you don't have the necessary experience or skills for a role, and this perpetuates self-limiting behaviour. Women talk themselves out of applying for roles, which then reduces the pool of potential female applicants for senior leadership and board roles. In my case, it took the encouragement of others, women and men I knew in the sector, to persuade me I could do the job. And now I feel it's my turn to persuade other women to do the same. I was worried that I did not have the skills or manner needed to be a board chair, which was primarily based on what I had seen myself in the past. Once in the role, I soon realised that I did not need to behave in a typically male fashion, stridently taking decisions or being confrontational. I was able to be a chair who fully supported the CEO and executive team, working in a sensitive and collaborative manner, listening to others and supporting decisions rather than needing to display my personal authority or superiority. I could lead and inspire in a fashion that worked for me and the organisation. In examining gender stereotypes in the workplace, Madeline Heilman, a psychology professor at New York University, explains that bias against women in leadership is often perpetuated because typical leadership is more closely aligned to male traits and behaviours. Women are therefore seen as not capable of being successful leaders, and when they are, and demonstrate those traits necessary to be successful leaders, they face the double bind of acting outside expectations and not being liked for doing so. In November 2020, Kim In-ji became the first female general manager in Major League Baseball history after being employed by the Miami Marlins. At 51, she had 30 years' experience in the major leagues, but told the media, "When I got into this business, it seemed unlikely a woman would lead a major league team, but I am dogged in the pursuit of my goals." I'd like to believe that high-profile appointments like this might signal the start of more women taking leadership roles in predominantly male-run sports. It's disappointing, though, to then look across at the US National Football League, where Susan Spencer, who took over the role at the Philadelphia Eagles in 1984, remains the only female general manager in the sport's history. Perhaps in the future we'll see more sports following the route of the Japan Football Association, who have recently announced plans for the country's first professional women's soccer league in 2021-22. For clubs to compete in the new-look Women Empowerment League, WE League, more than 50% of the club's executives and staff must be female. Toshima Kozo, the JFA president, boldly said he hoped the new league would encourage greater female representation in Japanese football and provide a platform for gender equality and wider business opportunities. How we contribute to society through sports is an important mission for all of us in the sports world. We will work on establishing the career of women's professional footballers, which is the dream of many girls, and further promote women's empowerment and solve social issues. Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstis. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.